So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation truly comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Israel, the prophets of Yahweh. So then we can understand the time of the end, and how then we should make plans for the adjustments of the near future. And it's always important pointing the rulership of the Gentiles, then the regular trade of the world. Always point China, because they are the nation related with the time of the end in terms of the leadership of the world's market. And then reading from the time of the Messiah, when he spoke and he gave many directives regarding the time of the end, and he obviously gave many details regarding Revelation. And those details, unfortunately, we do not have, but we have the previous covenant. And then you can find in Zechariah, Ezekiel, find in Daniel. But then you have to understand the times and seasons in order for you to unravel what it means, these prophecies for us in the future. So then, taking for example, in the past, where then nations, prior of the emancipation of the Great Britain's kingdom and its many places around the world, as then the world was being discovered. So we can understand what it meant for the English-speaking people, this emancipation of traveling around the world via the oceans and establishing then contacts and links. In many of the British empires, they were then placed in a system that was then obviously in Great Britain. So then we English-speaking people, sometimes we take for granted the understanding of this system of linkage from Great Britain and the many areas of the world, for instance Australia, New Zealand, and Jamaica, and many other areas around the world, where then the world, in fact, and the islands and many nations far distant became part of our system. They began to adopt technologies, new technologies, and then the new systems for their own countries, and they benefited greatly from this time of emancipation of the British Empire. So then later then came the Americans, and then they continue on, but in another type of linkage related with then making sure the world would be at peace after the Second World War. But those we can trace back of the important fact of the linking of nations via then the oceans. At the same understanding comes then at the end of times, where very importantly we find in Revelation, the 8th chapter, then China coming with a very inexpensive market, and then linking many countries under their own system. And kind of works in the same way, but then there is more relation with it, because they are including investments, stock market, and then pricing in the same system, where you can link up your bank and then make transactions and investments online. So it's extremely important, because while then the nations, they are linking themselves with the new system, you must understand, if the system is not computerized, what takes place is this: many nations, emerging nations, and also the developed nations, when they adopt a very inexpensive industry market, what it does simply increases the amount of trade, but then after some time it destroys the industry of the country making deals with China, because of the inexpensive market. That's kind of obvious. However, if you have then this system in a computer, where then many nations, they come, developed and undeveloped nations, they can invest in a system based upon the product that you select or the type of investment you select, and then you put it back in the system part of what you have earned. That's why then the system is self-contained. That's why it's so important having then the Chinese system around the planet. Because then any person with a basic computer at home can do trade, can do then investment, can do banking, and many other transactions related with this brand new system. So it self-sustains. As then the product from where you have invested your resources, as these products are more than demanded, the more you receive a tiny portion of it. Because a type of investment of this system. It's not a big profit, obviously, but then if you multiply by 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, then it becomes significant. And then around the world, many nations then doing trade and rebuilding, because we are during the rebuilding times. So then back in the old days, when Great Britain was then navigating around the world, many nations were savages. They were not civilized. And then they were able then to receive another type of lifestyle where they would be then making transactions with many countries. So in the same way, many of the countries around the world, they are in some sort of financial uncivilization, where then they must have some sort of a system to make sure it brings stabilization. And the only nation capable of this task is then obviously China. That's why of the main bulk of the prophecies from the previous covenant and then the renewed covenant, we find a very stable trade system in order for the prophecies then to easily take place. Because any country working against the system, then whatsoever scheme they use against the system turns back against them. That's why then Yahweh so wisely, He then orchestrates the entire system to work always on His behalf. So then we understand from the positive viewpoint that our nations coming out of poverty, such as many of them in Africa, they're going to benefit greatly from basics. And at the moment only the Chinese can provide in great quantities, so then the countries of Africa can then develop. But then they must have a computerized system so they can invest back whatsoever they earn. So then they won't squander amongst themselves. So responsible leaders then in Africa, when they receive this new system via computer, then the earnings of their trade, they can put it back in the system rather than pondering around with it and then squandering amongst themselves. This is what is going on then for years and decades. So then it's a self-sustaining system that each person then is given a share of it, but then the main earnings of the nation then stays in the country. However, it stays in the country in a virtual understanding, because then the investment is yet circulating around the world. That's why it's imperative of having China then start doing patrols at the Mideast. That's the very first step, because it's always a region of war and destruction and unrest. But as those countries they begin to observe the Chinese system coming and the benefits of their system, then they start relinquish war. And then very slowly but surely they're going to come to their senses, and then they must rebuild. And then each country must remain with its own integrity, understanding that the system of the Chinese, they are not going to take over nations. Those are simply a virtual understanding what the market then is leading us towards. Each country must have their own particulars. How they run their country, how they deal with their people, how they deal with their laws, and so on and so forth. But then there is the virtual stabilization of the system around. And the more they invest, the more they receive. So in order for this to take place, then obviously, and then the US and the other countries must come up with an understanding, and mostly US should retrieve, because then gives then the Chinese more chances and more space for them to begin to show themselves as a powerful nation with the absolutely objective of promoting peace via trade. And they can do it because they have their industry very strong to back them up. So it works on behalf of every nation. This, however, brings a lot of adjustment around the world, because then what they understand of investment is going to be then each particular country would invest in certain technologies where they themselves can start doing trade in a similar fashion. In other words, the main bulk of the manufacturing obviously comes from China, but then there are higher equipment, higher types of technologies requiring then each country to take the time and studying those and then producing them. Some of these areas, for instance, the electrical industry, electric mobility, in terms of recharging of systems, and then the production of the best mobile computerized systems. Because the more computer programs then designed to deal with this Chinese system, the more they can do transactions, and then each of those must be adapted to the country's understanding of distributing those systems, so then the country involved with it can retrieve its share from the trades then invested. So many of the countries would even do a system that does away with the taxes system. As those transactions are taking place, they are deducting already taxes from. And when there is a day of filing then the taxes, then the system becomes extremely simple, because it's already taken directly from each transaction. And this kind of a secondary system then providing the inhabitants of each country would then have this particular setup system personal per each country, or then should say produced or then created tailor-made per country, as then the directives of those countries decide to do so. But those that then require specialized software, and then combination of the country's way of doing finances with then personal finances of each family or each person doing trade via computer. Then the whole educational system, when a student is learning while going every day to the studies, then would have a specific area where they would teach those areas of finances, how to file those systems, how to deduct those taxes, how to balancing those areas, and how the students then can promote more technologies, so then each country, they won't be able to compete with China with the regular products, obviously, other than new technologies. So the whole system is truly coming in an area where then the Chinese would place this main, in quote, belt system, and then each ramification per country, they have their own systems, so they can distribute amongst the country and the people, and then they can receive a share of those, and those shares then are instant. As the transactions are taking place, each of those areas then are already placed in their own funding. So this gives more mobility to the leaders of the country to decide what to do and what not. And then filing taxes becomes a whole lot simpler. So truly, understanding of the old days, for instance, when Great Britain decided stay away from the Catholic system because of the influence of the popes of the time and trying to take over via religion. They were very wise in to be Protestants and to protest against those powers of the Pope and the papacy, and they did properly, because via these then the world became much more civilized. But then each country must remain then loyal to their systems so they can promote growth. And at the same time, the system then, because of the record that they must have per user, because each person then would have to give it an ID, obviously, because it's a system related with trade, and each person must be responsible for those trades. But it is a trade system where you invest and at the same time you are receiving, because of your investment, a certain number of products. That's why it's a new system. So far you have to invest in the company producing the products. This time you invest in the type of product or the line of product, and then because the much more demand of those, then it's very secure. And how you interpret the way you are going to do those systems per person, and then relating with your country, and then from the country to the system, that's up to you to come up with the software for it. But then maintains control of those areas, and then filing taxes becomes a whole lot easier, because you can identify with the ID that you give to make sure that this person is doing trade through your country and then via the system from China. And the same number or ID can be used for filing. So it is a brand new system and very handy. As then, when Great Britain would start up their empire, and in certain parts of the country they would have already a set up system of their own. Would have the government's house, a person that would be then in charge of making sure then the place would be profitable. From there they would have ships available, then from there they would produce either sugar cane or then breadfruit or then crops, and from there then becomes self-sustained. So this idea obviously is related with the Chinese, but then it's another much more sophisticated system. But the basic principles, those are the same. And we English-speaking people, we can relate, because our English background teaches us of then integration of systems. And since the English started around the world, it became the standard. So then acknowledging this fact and understanding the scripture, then we begin understanding, being in harmony with it. It's much easier, rather than people trying to come together and try to understand what the market brings. The market's already set. The understanding is then retrieving for certain aspects, and then making sure that the Chinese take on patrols, because they can stabilize the areas of the world in conflict, and then they do trade and they establish peace, because the trade is much more inviting than doing war or making wars. And then of course lending would be a whole lot easier. If you're a country that you lend part of your resource to another country, it would be a whole lot easier for you to understand what kind of safeguards you yourself would have, because then when you have lending going on, you have certain products that you are already investing, and these returns of those can be directly placed on the person that you are lending from. So at the same time you lend a certain amount and you are receiving as they are already investing in other products. But these transactions from country to country versus then what they relate themselves with the system, those are softwares that must be yet invented. And the Chinese already have this system. They're only waiting for the United States to get out of the way. In a kind way, speaking of, retrieval of the military, and then let the Chinese start then making sure those areas of conflict that then are placed under the control so they can start rebuilding. And as they do, then more products are being sold. And then those nations in trouble, they would have to have a system to maintain a record, because they have to be invested. Has to have funding in those countries then to rebuild them. And then with it comes computerized systems, and then they are engaged in the system already. And then other countries, for instance, like ours, extremely inflated with unworthy agencies, our system became unworthily fat. Fat, and absolutely unworthy. Because most of our agencies are not producing, they are only taking on money, they are only sucking. So it doesn't help our system. Our system is extremely inflated, it's not proper, it's not set up properly, it's not lean. And then we are spending our military they shouldn't be spending. We should be privatizing and leaning our government. So then we can come up with our own system, our own software system, how we're going to relate with the Chinese system versus each of the members of this country with a personal computer doing trade. So then we can reserve ourselves and then rebuild. While the Chinese have the most powerful military, and they can enforce then peace around the world. And obviously the leaders would visit the UN when there is a problem. But most of the inhabitants of the planet is going to be busy in the computer. So a whole lot more can be spoke of, but this is the main bulk of it, so then people can begin to start thinking of and coming up with the best software system combining the finances of the entire country, and then each member having a computer. Because so far we find most of the computerized system used for anarchy. If they analyze what the country is producing via internet versus the anarchy is far higher than the actual usage of the computer. There are people in this country violating high technical banking systems. They got nothing else to do. If they would have this Chinese system already, they would be producing. These hackers would be probably the most best employers. Because with such a vast knowledge in computer to hack into banking systems, have to have a very nice knowledge. So then rather than fighting against the hackers, heck, give them the chance of come up with the best software. They ended up employing people. Because the world must admit these hackers are the best computerized people that ever existed. Because they find ways of the weak areas of the system. However, if you turn these contrary and use them for building, then they can employ thousands upon thousands upon thousands. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.